In the spring of 1971, in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Tennessee, a 58-year-old farm widow named Nell Harmon counted $25 in ones onto a nursery counter for 500 peach trees that the nurseryman himself called firewood, and she planted every last one of them on the one piece of her farm that the whole county agreed was too poor to graze. Goats. By the time the feed store opened the next morning, the county had a name for her place. They called it the Stick Farm, and they laughed about it for 3 full growing seasons, right up until an August morning in 1974, when the smell coming down off that rocky hill grew so thick and so sweet that cars out on Route 9 began pulling onto the gravel shoulder one after another, engines idling, doors swinging open, until the man who had laughed the loudest stood in her orchard rows with his hat against his chest. Nell Harmon had not gone soft in the head. She had read something written in pencil, in a dead woman's careful hand, in a book bound in oilcloth the color of creek mud, and she had believed it when not one man in the valley had the patience to believe anything he could not see from the seat of a tractor. To understand what she did, you first have to see her. Nell was lean and straight-backed in the manner of women who have carried water uphill their whole lives, with gray hair wound into a knot and pinned with 2 bobby pins that had outlasted 2 presidents. She wore her late husband Otho's flannel shirts with the cuffs rolled twice, a canvas chore coat gone pale at the elbows, and rubber boots patched with inner tube rubber and contact cement. Her hands were large-knuckled and brown, mapped with old scars from fence wire and canning kettles, and when she spoke, which was not often, the words came out slow and level, each one placed where it belonged. She had buried Otho 2 autumns before, buried him on a Tuesday and milked that same evening, because the cow did not know it was a funeral day and a cow could not wait. Since then she had run the 80 acres alone, and the county had settled into a comfortable agreement that she was managing. In the thin, pitying tone people use for a widow, they expect to fail slowly and politely. Now you have to understand what everybody in that valley knew, because what everybody knows is the soil that mockery grows in. Everybody knew that orchard ground was bottom ground. The creek bottoms along Route 9 were black and deep and soft, and the fine orchards of the valley stood down there in straight, prosperous rows, because any man could see that good dirt makes good trees. Everybody knew that a hillside like Nell's, a shoulder of broken shale and sandstone sod where the topsoil ran thin as a worn blanket, was fit for nothing. Her own father-in-law had called it Slope the Goat Lot, and even the goats, the old men said, had filed a complaint. And everybody knew one thing more, the thing that mattered most in the spring of 1971. Everybody knew that a bare root peach whip with no leaf, no bud showing, and bark gone dull from sitting dry in a dump pile was a dead stick. You could see it was dead. It looked dead. And in that valley, what a thing looked like from the road was generally taken as the whole truth of it. The trees came to her the last week of March. Deese's nursery over toward Tellico had gone under that winter, the bank taking the greenhouses and the delivery truck, and what remained was a dump pile out behind the loading dock, 500 cull peach whips in bundles of 25, healed into nothing, roots open to the wind since February. They were Alberta stock, or had been. Vernon Deese stood over the pile in a coat too thin for the weather, a man watching his life get auctioned, and when Nell offered him her folded bills for the whole pile, he would not take the money at first. He turned one whip over in his hand and scraped it with his thumbnail and shook his head. He said, firewood. Missus, that is what you are buying. 500 sticks of firewood, and I will not have it said I sold a widow firewood and called it an orchard. Nell took the whip out of his hand, and with the small blade of her pocket knife she scratched a thin line low on the stem down near the root collar, and she held it up so he could see the color under the bark. Then she put the money in his coat pocket and said she would need help loading. That was all. 14 words from her, and a green secret under a gray skin, and neither one of them explained a thing to the other. Word travels in a farm county at roughly the speed of a party line. By Saturday, the men at the feed store had the whole story, improved considerably in the telling. Nell Harmon had hauled 2 truckloads of dead brush from a bankrupt nursery and was fixing to plant it, and not in her bottom field, which at least would have been a respectable mistake, but up on the goat lot, up in the rocks, where you could not sink a post hole without a pry bar. Grady Culp, who farmed 400 good bottom acres along the creek and kept the best of the valley's orchards, took his coffee off the counter, looked out at the ridgeline through the window, and delivered the line the county would repeat for 3 years. He said she was fencing kindling. The stick farm was born in that room, between the seed corn calendar and the pot-bellied stove, and it stuck the same as tar sticks. Children hollered it from the school bus windows. Somebody chalked it on the loading gate of her cattle chute at the sale barn. The postmaster asked her, gentle as a deacon, whether she planned to raise toothpicks or axe handles, and the men along the wall wheezed like a slow puncture. Nell heard all of it and answered none of it. That is a thing this story asks you to sit with, the silence of the woman while a county laughed. She was not deaf, and she was not made of stone. She was a widow alone with a mortgage note and a rocky hill, and every laugh cost her something she did not have extra of. But she had known something since she was 9 years old, kneeling in wet grass on frost mornings beside her grandmother, and what she knew was worth more to her than the good opinion of the feed store. What the men in that room were about to learn over the course of 3 mocking years and 1 black April night had been written down in soft pencil half a century before, by a woman none of them had ever heard of, in a book none of them would have stooped to read. And the whole of it, the secret entire, was sitting that very evening on Nell Harmon's kitchen table under a coal oil lamp, weighted open with a horseshoe. The book had belonged to her grandmother, Ada, who had kept orchards on these same ridges back when the century was new, before the good roads came, before the spray rigs and the extension pamphlets, back when a family that misjudged a frost did not lose a crop, it lost a winter's eating. Ada had died in 1944, and what she left behind was not money. It was a ledger-sized book covered in oilcloth, its corners worn round as river stones, every page filled edge to edge with pencil. Bloom dates going back to 1909. Sketches of pruning cuts, the names of winds, which hollows spoiled fruit and which shoulders of ground saved it, marked out in little hand-drawn maps with hatching for the slopes. Nell had watched that book being written. As a girl she had held the lantern while Ada walked the rows on freezing nights with a thermometer tied to a fence post, and she had asked her grandmother once why they always planted so high up, so far from the house, when the bottom looked so much easier. Ada did not answer in the moment. Grandmothers of that generation answered when the answer was ready. But that night she opened the oilcloth book to a page near the front and made the child read 2 lines aloud, and Nell could still recite them the morning she counted her ones onto Vernon Dease's counter. The first line said, "A dormant whip only looks dead. Look under the skin for the green, for the tree keeps its life hid in hard times, same as people do." And the second line, underlined twice, pressed so hard the pencil had grooved the paper, said, "Never set peaches where the cold water of the air can pool. Plant high on the shoulder and let the frost run downhill past you, the cold water of the air." Nell had carried that phrase for 50 years without ever once needing to defend it, and now she was going to bet a farm on it. Because here is what that book was actually claiming in its patient pencil voice, and hold it loose for now, because the proving of it is the whole back half of this story. The book claimed that cold on certain nights is not a blanket that falls evenly over a valley. It claimed that cold moves, that it has habits and a shape and a road it travels. And the book claimed that if you knew the road, you could stand your trees just off to the side of it and let ruin flow past your fence line downhill in the dark, to pool in the soft black bottoms where every sensible man had planted, while your rocky, laughable, goat-lot hillside stood untouched above the flood. If that sounds backward to you, then you are standing exactly where the whole county stood in April of 1971, coffee in hand, laughing at a widow. Stay standing there a while. The view is going to change. If you've made it this far into Nell's story, you already know why this channel keeps telling these. If you have ever watched a town decide that a steady, capable person had gone simple, if you have ever kept an old book or an old skill that the world called worthless, take 1 second and subscribe, and tell us in the comments what it was you kept. Somebody laughed at Ada once too. Now, back to the hill, because 500 trees were lying in a barn with their roots drying, and the clock on a bare root whip runs fast. She began the morning after the hauling. First came the soak. Nell filled both stock tanks and a cut-down molasses barrel with creek water, and stood the whips in root deep, bundle by bundle, 2 full days, until bark that had rattled like paper turned quiet and tight again. While they drank, she walked the hillside with a spade and a ball of twine and laid out her rows the old way. Not up and down the slope, but curving along the face of it, following the contour lines her grandmother had drawn in the book, so every row rode the shoulder of the hill at an even height. Then came the knife work, and this was the part that gathered spectators along the road fence, because to a passing truck it looked like pure madness. She pruned each whip down to a knuckle, cutting away most of what little there was, leaving a bare stem hardly taller than a milking stool with 2 or 3 buds hid under the bark. Men slowed their trucks to watch a woman apparently cutting her dead sticks shorter. What she was doing, the book said plain, was squaring the account, matching the top of the tree to a root that had been robbed by a dump pile, asking the whip to keep alive 1 hand's width of wood instead of an arm's length. A tree asked to do less, Ada wrote, will generally consent to live. The planting itself took 11 days, and it nearly took her with it. There was no plow ground up there. Every hole was dug with a mattock and a spud bar through sod and shale 2 feet across, boot deep, 500 and sometimes over, because she dug spares. Her palms split along the old callous lines, and she taped them with friction tape and kept swinging. She hauled water up the rocks in 10-gallon cream cans on a sled behind the tractor, 2 cans at a trip. The front wheels light and pawing at the grade. She puddled each root into its hole with a bucketful, spread the roots out on a little cone of packed dirt with her fingers the same as spreading a hen's wing, and firmed the ground with the heel of her boot in a slow circle. And then she did the last strange thing, the thing that made the feed store nearly weep with joy when word of it came down. Around every single trunk she piled a ring of stones, flat sandstone and creek rock, gathered off that same hill by the sled load, stacked to the height of her shin around each whip like 500 little chimneys. Grady Culp heard about the stone piles on a Thursday and had to set his coffee down. He said the stick farm had gone to monuments, that she was building 500 headstones and saving the county the trouble later. The counter crowd repeated the line clear into June. The stones were in the book, too. Page 41, in the pencil hand, with a sketch. Rock drinks the sun all day, Ada wrote, and breathes it back all night, and a young tree wants a warm ankle in a cold spring, the same as an old woman does. There was arithmetic under the folk voice of that sentence, and the arithmetic was real, and the county agent himself would stand in those rows one day with his hat pushed back, doing the figures out loud. But that day was 3 years off. In April of 1971, there was only a widow with taped hands, 500 pruned down sticks in curving rows on a rock pile, a ring of stones around every one, and a valley full of men who drove past slow on Route 9 with their windows down so she could hear them laughing. What followed was not a miracle. It was a grind, and the grind is the part of these stories that the laughing men never see, because the grind happens at hours when laughing men are still in bed. Nell walked the rows every morning before milking, all through that first spring, scratching her thumbnail low on a doubtful whip here and there, reading the color underneath. Green meant wait. Brown meant pull it, chalk a number in the book, and set a spare in the hole. By the middle of May, the first buds broke, red as match heads, on stems the county had certified dead, and by July, the hillside carried a faint green haze you could see from the mailboxes if you knew to look. Nobody knew to look. She carried water all that first summer, 2 cream cans at a time, up the grade in the heat, morning after morning, because a soaked root is a promise you have to keep making. She mowed the middles with a sickle bar and raked the hay right up against the stone rings for mulch. And every evening, at the kitchen table, under the lamp, she wrote, "Bud break by row. Rainfall out of a coffee can nailed to a post, which rows the deer worked." The oilcloth book had belonged to Ada. The composition book beside it, a new one, spiral-bound, was hers, and it filled at the rate of a page a night, in a hand nearly as careful as her grandmother's, because she was not just growing an orchard, she was standing up a witness. That first summer turned dry in August. 3 weeks with no rain and the creek gone to a whisper, and it cost her. Whips at the thin west end of the hill, where the shale ran closest to the surface, gave up faster than she could haul water to them. She pulled 41 dead in September, stacked them by the barn, and burned them on a still evening, and if you had been parked on Route 9 that night, you would have seen a small orange fire on a dark hill and a woman standing over it alone. And you could have been forgiven for thinking the county was right. The feed store certainly thought so. Somebody had counted the brush pile. 40 sticks down, 460 to go, Grady said, and offered to bring marshmallows next fall. But what the counter crowd did not count, because you cannot count it from a truck window, was the other number in the composition book. 460-odd trees still green under the thumbnail, most of them grown 2 feet of new whipwood over the summer, their stone rings holding the hay mulch damp underneath a week after every rain. Both numbers were real. only one of them turned out to matter. The second year brought the borers, and the borers came closer to beating her than the drought ever had. Peach tree borer is a clear winged moth that lays at the base of the trunk, and the grub tunnels the bark right at the root collar, girdling young trees from the inside while the leaves above stay green and lying. By the time Nell found the first gum, that telltale ooze of sap and sawdust at the soil line, the flight had been working her rows for a month. The book had an answer, an old one, and it stank. Moth crystals wanted money she was short of, so she went older still. The ring of tobacco stems and wood ashes worked in a collar around each trunk. And then, on her knees, wearing Otho's reading glasses, she went tree to tree with a length of stiff wire, feeling for the soft spot in the gum, running the wire up the tunnel, killing grubs by hand. 500 trunks, less the burned ones. It took her most of October on her knees on that rock in the wind. A man from the church drove up one Sunday to leave off a casserole and found her lying flat on the frozen ground with her cheek against a stone ring and her arm shoulder deep in wire work, and drove away convinced the poor Harmon widow was praying to the trees. That story improved by Wednesday, too. By deer season, it had her holding funerals up there. It was about then that the visit started, because in a farm county, mockery and appetite ride in the same truck. Grady Culp came up her lane in November of the second year, left the engine running, and made her an offer at the porch steps with his hat still on. He would take the whole hill off her hands, he said, at pasture price, do her the kindness of it before winter, seeing how things stood. Pasture price for 500 trees carrying 2 summers of her back and hands. Nell looked at him for a moment, the same as she had looked at Vernon Dease's dying whip, reading something under the skin, and then she said the longest sentence anybody in the county had gotten out of her in 2 years. She told him the hill was not for sale, but that he ought to come back in 3 Aprils and she would show him what he had offered to buy. Grady laughed about that at the feed store, told it on himself, said the widow had gone to prophecy now. But you will want to remember that he was the one man in the valley who never quite managed to stop driving past slow. There is a kind of man who laughs loudest exactly at the things he cannot look away from, and the patient ones among you already know which fence he ends up standing at, hat off, before this story lets him go. The third spring, the trees bloomed all at once. The first week of April, the whole hillside went pink. 440 trees flowering in curving rows on ground certified fit for nothing. And for 1 week, the stick farm was, quietly, without a single soul admitting it out loud, the prettiest thing visible from Route 9. Old women made their husbands slow down by the mailboxes. And then the bloom fell, as bloom does, and the fruit set was thin, as a first setting is, and what little set she thinned harder, 2 green peaches to a hand width, because the book said a young tree asked to carry too much will spend itself in a season. What ripened at 3rd August amounted to a few bushels, small fruit but true, sweet clear through, and she sold not 1 peach of it. She gave baskets to the church and the school and the mail carrier, and she carried a basket to every farm along her stretch of road, including, and the county chewed on this for a month, the Culp place. Grady's wife met her at the door. It is recorded in the composition book in Nell's level hand that the basket was returned empty 2 days later with a pound cake in it, and that Grady himself was seen at the fence line that same evening looking up at the hill for a long while. The men laughed on. The wives, by the 3rd year, had mostly stopped. Then came the winter that nearly ended it, and it did not come as weather. It came as a sedan with a government plate. The county extension agent, a young man named Pruitt with a clipboard and a fresh degree, drove up her lane in February of 1974 on what he called a courtesy call. He walked her rows in city overshoes, and to his credit, he walked all of them. And then he stood in her kitchen and told her, kindly, the sum of everything his textbooks knew. He said, "Mrs. Harmon, I will not pretend this isn't handsome work, because it is. But you have 500 trees on droughty shale with no irrigation, you're doctoring borers with wire and stove ashes, and you have set a commercial orchard on your coldest, most exposed ground, while your best bottom field sits in grass. Fruit ground is bottom ground. Every operation on this road knows it. My office cannot in good conscience write this up as anything but a hobby. And I would be doing you no favors to promise you an orchard. Rockin' old-time notions never yet made one." He left her a pamphlet on beef cattle. She set it under the short leg of the porch table, where it did faithful service for years. You should not imagine that his words slid off her. That night was the low water mark of the whole 7 years this story covers. The mortgage on the 80 acres was due in its season, no matter what a hillside did. Her hands that winter had swollen so that she buttoned Otho's shirts with a crochet hook. And now the state itself, the office with the university behind it. The young man paid to know had stood in her kitchen and pronounced the same verdict as the feed store, only politely, with figures. In the lamplight, well past midnight, Nell sat with both books open, Ada's oilcloth and her own spiral, and by her own account she got as far as putting a price on the hill, working out what 440 trees would fetch as pasture. Plus, the cattle the pamphlet promised. The pencil sat on the paper a long time. Then she turned to the front of the oilcloth book, to the page a 9-year-old girl had once been made to read out loud in a cold kitchen, very like this one, and she read it again, alone, moving her lips. "It only looks dead," said the pencil. "The life stays hid in hard times, same as people do." She closed the book, banked the stove, and went to bed. In the spiral book, under that date, there is a single line. It says she would give the hill one more April, and then it says, underlined once, "The frost will testify." 60 days later, the frost took the stand. The late April freeze of 1974 is still spoken of along that road, and it arrived exactly as the old books always said the killing ones do, not roaring, but silent. A soft, warm week had pulled every orchard in the valley into full bloom, bottoms and hill alike, and then a front came through on a Thursday with a cold rain, and behind it the sky wiped itself perfectly clean. By supper-time the wind lay down flat. Stars came out hard as tacks. Anyone who has farmed fruit knows that particular stillness, and there were men up and down the creek that night who stood in their yards at 10 o'clock, feeling the air go glassy and quiet, and knew what was being prepared for them, and could do nothing but light smudge pots and pray. The bottoms glowed all night with little orange fires. Grady Culp and his boys ran oil heaters and burned old tires at the row ends till their eyes streamed. It did not matter, and the reason it did not matter is the entire secret of this story, and it was pooling around their ankles even as they fought, invisible, patient, obedient to nothing but its own weight. Nell woke at 2, the hour Ada's book called the thief's hour, and walked out into a cold that made her breath stand still around her. She read her thermometers by lantern, one nailed low at the foot of the hill by the road gate, one halfway up in the orchard rows. She wrote both numbers down, and then, because there was nothing else to be done, she stood a while among her trees in the dark. She would say later that the hillside that night did not feel like the coldest place on the farm. It felt oddly gentle, a held breath, while below her, down along the creek where the good ground lay, the smudge fires burned in a low orange string, and the flames stood absolutely straight, and everything they were protecting was already lost. Morning made it plain. The sun came up on a valley that looked, from the road, unchanged until you got close to a blossom. In the bottoms, every open flower had gone soft and watered dark at its middle, and by 10 o'clock they were browning. Orchard after orchard, the whole year's crop dying on the branch in one quiet morning. Men walked their rows, pinching blooms open with their thumbs, searching thousands of flowers for one live green center and finding cooked black ones and not saying anything because there was nothing to say. The freeze had run the whole valley floor. And then, one by one, standing in their ruined rows, they did what people in a valley cannot help doing. They looked up. Above them, on the shoulder of rock they had named the Stick Farm. In plain sight of Route 9 and the school bus and the church parking lot and God and everybody, 440 peach trees stood in full pink bloom, untouched, unburnt, humming with every bee in the county, the only living orchard color from one end of the valley to the other. Grady Culp stood at his own fence in his smoke-ruined coat, looking up at it for the better part of an hour. His wife watched him from the kitchen window and let him be. Now the mechanism, plainly, because you have waited 3 years of story for it, and Nell would want it told straight, the same as the book tells it. Cold air is heavy air. On a still, clear night, when there is no wind to stir the pot, the ground loses its day's heat to the open sky. The air lying against it chills, and that chilled air does not sit where it was made. It slides. It flows downhill along the ground, over sod and around barns, exactly like water you cannot see, following the swales and lanes, and it gathers where water would gather, in the low ground, in the creek bottoms, in the soft black fields that every sensible man had planted, and there it pools and deepens through the small hours until the fruit blossoms standing in it freeze from below. That is a frost pocket, and the fine orchards of the valley stood in the bottom of one. A hillside partway up a slope sits above the pool. The cold made on the heights slides down across it and keeps on going, always moving, never pooling, so on the killing nights the shoulder of the hill can stand 10 and 12 degrees warmer than the bottoms below it. Old orchard people had a name for that shelf of spared ground. They called it the thermal belt, and Ada's pencil maps, with their hatched slopes and their twice underlined warning, were charts of it. Her numbers that April night said the same, and Pruitt would later check the figures himself and find them true. And the other half of the secret, the $25 half, was just as plain. A bare root whip in March is asleep, not dead. Its life is banked in the cambium, the thin green ring under the bark, and a dry gray stick with living cambium and a hard pruning, and a bucket of water is a peach tree entire. Vernon Dease had been selling firewood by its looks. Nell had bought 500 living trees by their insides at a nickel apiece, because she was the one person at that dump pile who knew where a tree keeps its life and where the cold keeps its road. The frost was April. The proof, the kind of proof a county can put its hand on, came in August, and it came in on the wind. 440 young trees spared the freeze and thinned by a careful hand, ripened all together in the last week of that month. And a hillside of tree-ripe Albertus in still summer heat does something that no bushel basket at a market ever does. It breathes. The smell came down off that rock in the warm evenings, down across the pasture and the road fence, and it lay over Route 9 like something you could lean against. Peaches and warm stone and cut hay. So dense and so sweet that people driving home with their windows down found themselves slowing before they knew why. The first car pulled onto the shoulder on a Friday evening, a Knoxville family who sat there a minute smelling it and then just followed it up the lane on foot. Nell sold them a peck out of a bushel basket on her porch. The next evening there were 4 cars. The Sunday after church there were 11, nose to tail on the gravel shoulder, doors hanging open, children pointing up at the pink gold hill, and a deputy came out, not to clear the road, but to buy for his mother, and left his cruiser at the end of the line with everybody else's. By Labor Day week, traffic on that stretch had its own habits. You slowed at the Harmon place, you rolled your window down, whether you meant to stop or not, and likelier than not, you stopped. Folded bills went into a coffee can on the porch rail when Nell was up the hill picking. Nobody in the county ever claimed that can came up short, and there were men putting money in it who 3 summers back had hollered stick farm out of moving trucks. The smell did what no argument, no sermon, and no extension pamphlet could have done. It stopped the traffic, and it stopped the laughing, in the same week, on the same road. The fence crossing came quiet, as it always does. On a Tuesday morning, early, Nell looked down from her ladder and found a young man standing at the row end with his cap in both hands. It was Grady Cup's eldest, Toby, 19 that summer, and he stood like a man at a church door until she came down. He said, "My father didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here." And then, looking at his boots, he asked, "Would you show me how you knew?" About the hill. I'd sooner learn it than have to be told it in a bad year. She put him on the ladder and taught him to pick by the smell of the stem end, and he stayed till milking. Grady himself came the following Sunday in his good hat and took it off at her gate. Whatever else was said between them stayed between them, but the part the county repeats came at the end on the porch where he looked out over the bottoms and said, loud enough for his boy to hear him say it, "I called this place the Stick Farm for 3 years, Nell. I was wrong for every one of them. Now I'm asking you to tell me where my cold goes." And she did. That is the whole miracle of the ending, if you want it in one line. He asked, and she told. She walked them all, that fall, the same as her grandmother had once walked her. Culp men and the rest of the creek bottom growers, 7 or 8 of them some evenings, up the lane after supper with notebooks, grown men who had laughed at her stone rings now sketching them. She showed them the thermometers on their posts and made them read both at the thief's hour so they would believe their own eyes and not her. She showed them where the cold slid off her shoulder of rock and where it settled on their land, and which of their own knobs and benches stood above the pool, and more than one man in that company planted his next orchard high, on ground his father had called waste. Pruitt came back too, and to his lasting credit he came with his hat pushed back and his clipboard put away. He copied her thermometer records into the county files by hand, both winters of them, and the write-up he sent to the university named the practice properly, cold air drainage, orchard sitting in the thermal belt, and cited as its source the private records of an orchardist of the county. The book with the oilcloth cover is named in the citation, Ada, dead 30 years, entered the university's files that autumn, spelled right, in ink. Nell Harmon kept the hill another 19 years. The coffee can gave over to a plank stand, and the stand to a small tin-roofed shed with a scale and a bell. And stopping at the Harmon place in late August became one of the things that road did, a habit of the county, the same as slowing for the school bus. She never expanded down into the bottom, though it lay there in grass, good and black and easy, all those years. Asked why once, she said the bottom was fine ground for a man who liked to gamble against the sky, and went back to her thinning. The composition books filled, one a year, bloom dates and thermometer readings in a hand that got slowly larger as her eyes went, and the oilcloth book sat under the lamp, retired, consulted the same as Scripture, which is to say, not often and always at need. And on an August evening a long time after all of this, her grandniece, a girl of 9, sent up from Chattanooga for the picking, stood in the orchard rows at sundown with a peach warm off the tree in both hands, and bit it, and the juice ran down her wrist, and Nell, from the ladder, told her the words this whole story has been carrying uphill for 60 years. A dormant whip only looks dead, she said. Same as people. Now eat your peach. So that is the Stick Farm, which the maps never called anything but the Harmon place, and which the county for about 3 years called a widow's foolishness. 500 dead trees for $25, a book in a dead woman's pencil, and a hillside that stood pink above a frozen valley because one stubborn soul knew that cold runs downhill like water and that life hides deepest right when it looks most gone. The laughing was free, and the men who did it paid for it anyway, in the coin of standing in their own brown blossoms looking up. The teaching was worth money, and she gave it away for nothing at her gate. If you have an Ada in your family, somebody whose old notions got waved off while the world went and bought what looked shiny, tell us about them in the comments below and say what hill they would have planted. And if this story sat well with you, subscribe and share it with somebody who is out on their own rocky ground right now, still hauling water, still hearing the trucks slow down and laugh. Here is the question Nell's Valley leaves us with, and it is worth turning over slow. Would you have put your trees in the easy black bottom where everybody said the good ground was? Or would you have carried water up the rocks for 3 mocked years to plant where the frost runs past? Think on where the cold goes before you answer, and may every dead stick you ever bet on turn out to be only sleeping.